And at that point, things got quite ugly, and there was this long battle between the guests and the owner, and it ended up going to the landlord and tenant board.
Hello, and welcome to the next edition of Beneath the Law. My name is Gavin Ty. I'm here with my good friend, partner, Stephen Teal, as usual. And today we have another very special guest. And Stephen, maybe you could have the honor of introducing our guest to the podcast.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm very pleased to do so. So we are joined by Toronto Star reporter May Warren. And so she's with the Star's housing team. And just let me give you a brief background in terms of who May is. So she's a graduate of Toronto Metropolitan University's Master of Journalism program, first joining the Toronto Star as a summer intern in 2014. She then worked at Guelph Mercury and Metro Toronto, and then returned to the Star in 2018. And she's covered some really great stories, Gavin, including the Danforth shooting, and the St. Michael's College sexual assault investigation. Very prominent stories. And before actually joining the housing team, she was covering for 2.5 years the pandemic, from its first days that the new virus was announced and the city started its vaccine rollout. So she's also the winner of 3 Ontario newspaper awards. Congratulations, by the way, for that, May, which include General News feature for a story on Guelph's women's medically assisted death before that became legal, and was nominated as part of the Toronto Star team for a National Newspaper Award for coverage of the crash of Flight 752 in early 2020, and as part of the team for Project of the Year for 2019 series on OHIP billing. So a very great background, great stories to be covering, and very pleased to have May join us on this podcast, Gavin.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, May, for coming on board today. Today we're going to be talking about, I think, a story you wrote which sparked an interest in the gap, if you will, between the regulatory environment for a tenant and a guest in a temporary rental situation, an Airbnb rental in this particular instance. And maybe, May, you could give us a little bit of the background story on how this whole situation came about.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that very nice intro. So this story, as you say, it's an interesting one because it kind of exposes a lot of issues between landlords and tenants and Airbnb guests. And the background of it all is that there was this couple coming from Switzerland. The husband, I think, was going to be a visiting professor for some months at York University, and they were looking for a place to stay. They didn't want to lock into a year-long lease, but it was more than just a hotel stay. They wanted something a little kind of bit in between. And they ended up booking a 10-month Airbnb stay at this lovely home in midtown Toronto, and everything seemed fine. Their kids were going to school there. They were settling in. They got along well with the landlord. But then the landlord wanted the property back, basically. They said to move back in. They had a family emergency, and that they were the owner of the home. So there was a bit of back and forth there, and a lot of tension between the landlord and the guests at that point. And the booking end date ended up being changed. So instead of going, I think, from summer of 22 to June of this year, it was ended in January. And at that point, things got quite ugly, and there was this long battle between the guests and the owner, and it ended up going to the landlord and tenant board to determine if these kind of mid to long-term Airbnb guests are tenants and have the rights of tenants under the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act.
Interesting, because you know, one of the things that jumped out at me in this story is I never think about Airbnbs being for 10 months. I mean, I think of like an Airbnb, like, oh, you're renting it for the weekend kind of thing. 10 months seems an awfully long time on an Airbnb.
For sure. And yeah, as you say, you think about it as maybe you're going for a week somewhere or a weekend to somewhere for a party or something. You wouldn't think about it as something that fell into more of that range of that mid to long term stay. But definitely in this case, it was more that they wanted something where they could kind of settle in a bit, right? And we have heard from housing advocates and tenant advocates that these kind of mid to long term Airbnb stays are becoming more popular in the city. There's an estimated 12,000 by their count, not by Airbnb's count, but by their count of these stays in the city. So it does seem to be becoming a more popular area of Airbnb staying. These longer terms.
Is that being driven perhaps by the City of Toronto policy that doesn't seem to cover rentals beyond 28 days as part of their short-term rental policy? Is that why, like, is there a gap there for a landlord to kind of skirt around compliance with city bylaws?
Yeah, that's certainly what a lot of the tenant advocates that I spoke to for these series of stories are arguing. And they're saying that because listings for more than 28 days, so roughly more than a month, fall outside of the short-term rental regulations, that landlords can kind of use this as a loophole to get, as you say, get around the regulations as they are now. I also think that just the general context of the rental market right now may also play a role because it is hard to find a rental. Rentals are, as we know, very expensive. And to have this kind of, some would call it like a shadow rental market, there is a little more flexibility, a little more opportunity there as well.
Yeah, I think there really is a gap in this. And in this particular case, as I understand it, this particular tenant, as you mentioned, was coming from abroad, looking for a place to stay in Toronto for a lengthy period of time, but less than the usual lease period, which is generally a year, I suppose. And there was some toing and froing as to whether or not this should be done over the Airbnb platform or whether they should have entered into a more formal or typical residential tenancy type lease. And I think that figured pretty prominently in the decision of the board to say, well, everybody turned their mind to it, and the documentation that they used indicated that nobody thought this was a regular lease. Everybody thought it was a Airbnb short-term rental.
Yeah, they didn't sign a proper lease. Yeah, as you say, there was some back and forth between the tenant and the landlord. There was a dispute about whether they were actually tenants, but for the purpose of the hearing, they did call them tenants. There was a bit of a dispute between the two about, whether to sign a lease, and I think the landlord wanted to stay on the Airbnb platform. And at the end of the day, the landlord and tenant board adjudicator ruled that this fell under an exemption for, I think it was called the traveling vacation public exemption, that, because they came from abroad, because there wasn't a lease, because there were things like linens and towels stocked in the property, that they didn't qualify as official tenants and didn't have like tenant rights under the RTA. But I think the adjudicator was careful to say this was what he found in this specific situation, and that, the circumstances could be different for another situation. And it kind of depends on the specifics of each situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very interesting in terms of the exception that's set out in the statute for the traveling public or a seasonal or temporary kind of accommodation, that those kinds of accommodations don't fall under the legislation, that it actually doesn't have any parameters with respect to date. So you can basically have a member of the traveling public rent for 2 years, let's say, through an Airbnb platform and fall outside of the statute, which, and I think, as Gavin quite rightly points out, would tend to suggest a lot more permanency to the rental.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you are a tenant in that situation and you're renting for, say, 10 months or a year or 2 years, you probably start to think of yourself as being in a more permanent situation, and you get used to it and you have that relationship with the landlord. But this case really shows that, at least in this situation, they did not consider them to be formal tenants with all of those rights under the law.
Yeah, interestingly, I think just picking up on that point, May, I think I'll call them the guests rather than the tenants. They thought of themselves as being pretty permanent. As I understand, the evidence that was led at the hearing was, wait a minute, we've got roots now in the community. We've got government documents that to indicate this is our permanent address. Wait a minute here. We've taken the usual steps that one would generally take to say we're not just staying here. We live here. And the board said, too bad. The deal from the beginning, as far as the landlord and the tenant were concerned, was regardless of whether you've set down roots or not after the fact, was one of transience, for lack of a better word, rather than permanence.
Totally. And, the guests were saying that they had their kids in the local schools and that they'd really put down, as you say, roots in the community, and it would be very disruptive for them to leave. It would be hard for them to find a comparable rental in the community for a comparable price. All these things. But in the end, they were less protected than they thought they were, at least according to the tribunal.
And my understanding, too, in terms of part of the government documents, and I'm not sure that it was detailed in the decision, was that the guests or tenants actually had work permits and that their children had study permits.
Yeah, and I think they were presenting things like driver's licenses and health cards with that listed as the official address. And the kids were in school, and they definitely thought of it as a more permanent arrangement, even though it's my understanding was that they were planning to go back to Europe at some point after the husband's residency at York was over. They did. It wasn't a vacation to them, I guess. It was a semi-permanent arrangement.
Interesting. Now, one thing I thought that was curious, maybe you know a bit more about this, and Stephen, than I do, but the reason the landlord gave for the early termination of the prearranged term of the visit, of the 10-month visit, was that they themselves needed the premises to occupy it for themselves. And, I believe that there is a basis for evicting a tenant, and one quite regularly, and some people would say sometimes not appropriately, utilized by landlords, is to say, no, you've got to get out because I'm moving in. So I'm wondering, would there have been any benefit to this tenant of winning? Well, would that not have been a reason to evict the tenant on what was effectively, I suppose, a month-to-month tenancy? Or was it a fixed-term tenancy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I believe you're right. As if it was considered a formal tenancy, then they would have been able to evict based on the premise of them wanting to move into the premises, which is what they said they wanted to do. But in this case, since the guests weren't considered tenants, I don't know if the reason even mattered why they wanted it back. Like, they owned it, they made the listing. So I'm not sure if the adjudicator really commented on that. I'd have to look more carefully at the decision, but it seemed to me that the overall conclusion was, you're not a tenant, you don't have tenant rights, and the landlord can decide what they want to do with their own property in this case.
But right, and Gavin, you're right. So under under the Residential Tenancies Act, I have to catch myself because I used to represent tenants a long time ago, when it was, I guess, the Tenant Protection Act, or even the Landlord Tenant Act, maybe way back when. Under the Residential Tenancies Act, a owner of a property certainly can give notice to their tenant where they are either going to occupy the rental accommodation or premises for their own use or for the use of a child, and it has to be legitimate. But my understanding of the legislation as well is that for that last month of rent, you as the owner need to actually pay the last month back to the tenant. So there are some financial obligations under the statute that, I suppose a lot of folks, never raise, or they skirt around that issue. So that could have happened, and also, there's now, I guess, a lot of renovations going on that have created a lot of problems as well. And if I understand this May correctly, and reading other media reports about this landlord seemed to have had a bit of a history with respect to these kinds of evictions as well, which actually is not drawn out in the decision. So I don't know in terms of the evidence that was provided, and you may be right that it was completely irrelevant.
Yeah, I had heard some anecdotal stuff about the landlord's past. I hadn't been able to really prove that enough to put it in the story, being confident about it being a pattern. I do know that at one point they may still own it. I think they did own another property in the neighborhood. And that was kind of what the tenant was saying, like, oh, they're just trying to get us out so they can jack up the rent and all this kind of thing. But it got quite ugly between the two parties, so it was hard to know exactly what was going on there, and was trying to keep it just at the level of the facts. But yeah, as you say, I don't think the decision really goes into that history, and I'm not sure if they found it relevant, or they were just trying to stick to the bigger topic of are they a tenant? Do they deserve the compensation, as you say, under the Tenancy Act? Do they deserve notice? All those kinds of things. Do they deserve basically the protections and the rights that a tenant would have?
Now, do you know if the decision has been reviewed yet? My understanding is that there was some form of a appeal that may have been launched, but normally under the Landlord-Tenant Board, you do have a right to have a decision reviewed.
I'm not sure about that, actually. The last I heard, I think the guests were planning to appeal, but I have to admit I haven't followed up on it recently, so I'm not sure where that.
Well, let me just sort of tie that question with sort of something that's been troubling me when I look at this from a very practical kind of level. You've got people that are living in this unit. Landlord comes along in the middle of the term and says, you got to get out. They bring this application. Did they continue to occupy the premises while that application was being heard?
Yes, my understanding is that they did.
Okay, so this is interesting from a kind of procedural perspective, because if the remedy is I want to stay here till the end of June 2023, did they get their remedy even though they lost the case? Because your story's dated June 15th, 2023. I take it they were still residing in the premises as of that date.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
So they got it. And now if healing, where did they move out on June 30th, or are they still there?
I think that they were still there up until, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe they were still there up until right before the hearing, and then the landlord tried to lock them out, or maybe did lock them out, and they were staying with neighbors, but they very nearly got to the end of their term, I guess.
So they used the process to achieve the remedy, which was I take it they were practically speaking evicted if the locks were changed and they had to stay with a neighbor, but I take it they got back in again.
Yeah, I'm a little bit fuzzy on the exact back and forth, and it was honestly so contentious between the two parties. But yeah, they definitely refused to leave. And we're very adamant, no, this is our home. We are going to stay here. We are the tenants. We have rights. And they were in the unit for months past when the landlord wanted them out.
And Gavin, that's actually a very interesting point. So if in fact the tenancy or the agreement is not covered by the Residential Tenancies Act, it is then a commercial tenancy. And the Commercial Tenancy Act has a very different form of process for eviction. I mean, you have no rights really as a commercial tenant where the agreement has been breached. And if I understand correctly, Airbnb's platform permitted the owner or the landlord the ability to actually change the date as to when the guest was supposed to leave.
Right.
So
Right.
then you now have a breach of contract, and technically you could be under, I guess, the Commercial Tenancies Act that would allow a different form of eviction in a breach of lease situation, where you could actually call somebody in to actually change those locks.
Yeah, my point was really just on a practical level. If the remedy that was sought to be achieved by the tenant was to remain in the premises until the end of June, and even though they lost, they remained in the premises till the end of June, the landlord couldn't win for losing. If you get my point. So
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, and it was an interesting choice to just stay in the home.
Now, May, I had
as much as possible.
I had also read that so the early termination by the quote landlord was in January, right? They wanted them out by the end of January of 2023 rather than June of 2023, and after that date, there seems to be some kind of report or indication that the tenants were actually not paying rent. Is that true?
That I believe that is true.
So they
Yes.
not only stayed there, but
Yeah.
they got to stay for free?
I believe that they did not pay rent for that time. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I believe that is the
I'm
case.
beginning
Yeah.
to feel less and
Yeah.
less sorry for them. I'm sorry, May. I know
Yeah, no. I mean, I
victims
definitely
in
can
the
see
drama,
both
but
sides of it.
that's a pretty
I
good
definitely
deal.
can see both sides of it, and trying to put myself in the shoes of the tenant and the landlord. It's a very complicated situation for sure. But to me, it's kind of like a bit of a cautionary tale for both sides. Like as a landlord, just to know that it's going to be quite a complicated situation, possibly if you want to take the property back early on a long-term stay, even if the tribunal has ruled that it's not a tenancy, that you may still have some conflict there. And it's still a bit of a gray area. And then for the tenants, just to know, it isn't as permanent as you may think.
Well, that's a great
yeah.
point. I mean, I think that from the landlord's perspective, yeah, it's great that I've got a 10-month rental and I don't have to keep flipping people in and out of this property and sending in the cleaning crew and doing all the things that are, look, operating a hotel is a lot of work. You got to have the rooms cleaned up every day. You got to change the thing. You got to register. You got to do all of that. Pretty easy when you've got sort of the one guest staying in the hotel room, if you will, for 10 months. That becomes a lot less work. And if you can just cash the check, and that's great. So I think the landlord was probably thinking this was terrific, and particularly if they had the option to kick them out anytime they wanted to when they got being cynical, when they got a better offer, let's say. But I think that people who are using Airbnb should be very cautious that they are using the wrong tool for what is a long-term rental, and they can end up in exactly the situation that we just talked about, which is they are really hoisted on their own petard, so to speak, in the sense that they're now got people living in their premises. They're making no money because they're not paying, and they're being dragged through a litigious process, an adversarial process in front of the board. Even if they win, that they end up that the tenants has got what they wanted in the end, and then some, by not paying any rent.
Yeah, and I think that's what the landlord was kind of expressing to me kind of at the end of the process, was just that this had been a terrible time for their family on top of their, personal emergency that they'd had, and that they just didn't really understand that it could go this wrong, I guess, and they wanted to warn other landlords that this is a possibility, and just to understand what you're getting into with these longer term stays. And as you say, they're not using the tools it's not the right channel for that, I guess, if that's more what they're looking for, to have a longer term tenant.
For sure, and for the landlord, there's potential reputational loss. Because you have, as you mentioned, these other anecdotal stories that seem to hover around the landlord, but when you're digging into what actually happened, the landlord has suffered potentially, financially, it sounds like, and now is also suffering reputational loss, and maybe we should be a little bit more sympathetic to the landlord's plight in this case. But the cautionary tale comment really stands out to me because quickly, I own an Airbnb type unit elsewhere, not here in Ontario, but more as an investment property. But I have a property manager to manage that property, so that I'm not directly engaged with anybody that rents the unit. And when I think about this, you really take a risk as a landlord when you're doing this on your own, and you don't have an actual property manager who is up on the laws, the tenancy laws, commercial and residential, to act as the go-between to manage your property.
Yeah, I'm picking up on that. I mean, even the word landlord always, I still find it kind of offensive, in the sense it always makes me think of the big bad landlord, chasing out the poor tenant. But, in these types of situations with Airbnb, and I'm not sure if this was one of them, but, we live in a city right now where it's incredibly expensive, if not impossibly expensive, to afford a home. Interest rates have gone up. Carrying a mortgage is a huge burden for people. And a lot of people are looking at, well, can I rent out a part of my house, make a couple of extra bucks to carry this property, for another month or what have you. So the landlord in often situations is people that are just trying to get by, trying to make a couple of little extra money on the side by renting out a portion of their home to people coming and going. So it is a real cautionary tale. I agree with you. And there's a lot of risk when you're renting out property, and it's not just sort of big corporate landlords or whatever. It's real people, and this is real money. And I'm sure for these people who own this property, I don't know anything about them, but I can imagine that having that income, being deprived of that income and deprived of the use of that property for that period of time, was a real burden. And for a real person, in this day and age, that can have serious consequences.
For sure. And the point about the property manager and just understanding, all of the laws and everything, I think is a good one. And definitely this is an area where I can see people being confused, because it is confusing, the longer term Airbnb stays. And this case kind of highlights how there's a lot of gray area. But I remember when I first reached out to the landlord to do due diligence and get their comment, or the owner, or whatever you prefer to call her, she was very surprised, like thinking, this is just an Airbnb transaction. Like, I don't understand why this is an issue. I thought this was all covered through Airbnb. So yeah, it's easy to not understand the implications, I guess, of all of these different kind of policy loopholes and gray areas with a platform like Airbnb or any short-term rental platform.
In terms of the advocates that you've spoken to, have they raised any issues of amending the Residential Tenancies Act to make it a little bit more clear as to what would qualify for an exemption under the statute? Have they talked about time parameters in terms of the length of a rental being an important factor, even if it is for, quote, a traveler?
Yeah, I think what they've expressed to me is just a frustration with the city regulations, I think, a little bit, and wanting to kind of close that 28-day loophole, and wanting to make sure that in a general sense, not even talking about this situation, but in a general sense, that these kinds of stays can't be abused, and that there's more clarity, I guess, in terms of the policy. In terms of changing the Residential Tenancies Act, that's a possibility as well. I can't recall anyone specifically mentioning that, but yeah, they're definitely saying that these types of arrangements are becoming more common in the city, and that it's not just an isolated case. It's something that they're seeing more and more.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see more and more of it, as I said, as affordability digs its claws into everyday people, and people are trying to look for any means to find some extra revenue, and other people are looking for places to live. So, May, we wanted to thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your insights on this case and this particular situation. It's a real topical issue, and one that, you'll pardon the pun, really hits home. So thanks again for joining us, And Stephen, thanks for coming along. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Beneath the Law. Please give us any ratings or feedback that you can. We always love to hear from everyone, and we really appreciate those ratings when you're listening on it. Any suggestions you have for future episodes, thrilled to have that from you. So, as we always say, if no one is above the law, then everyone is beneath it. So, thanks again for joining us on this episode of Beneath the Law, and we hope to hear from you, and I hope you look forward to hearing from us again.